Welcome to Anticipated U.S. Tax Policies in 2025. I'm Philip Behren, Chair of the Taxation Law section of the BHBA. The tax section is sponsored by Hochman, Salk and Toscher Perez. The Hochman, Salk and Toscher Perez advantage is experience and eye for innovation and a genuine dedication to clients, their families, and their business, in addition to their national practice in civil tax and criminal tax controversies and related litigation in federal and state courts. The firm is also active and successful in handling non-tax matters such as business and estate planning for high net worth individuals and closely held businesses, together with white-collar defense and commercial disputes. Now onto the program. Today's program is led by Andrew Grossman, Professor Edward McCaffery, Loren Pons, and moderated by Robert Russell. Robert Russell is Senior Counsel at Taylor Nelson Amitrano, specializing in representing clients in federal and state tax examination, appeals, and litigation. With prior roles at the IRS, Department of Treasury, and Joint Committee on Taxation, he has deep expertise in government enforcement and tax policies. And last but not least, he is a valued member of our tax section. If you are interested in regular discussions about tax law or would like to contribute to planning our upcoming programs, we invite you to join the BHBA Tax Section monthly meetings. These take place every third Thursday of the month at 4 p.m. Feel free to email me with any questions or visit the BHBA calendar to register. We look forward to your participation. And now let's turn it over to our panelist. Robert, take it away.
Thank you, Philip, and great to be here. Yes, this is the anticipated U.S. tax policies in 2025. And I must say, I don't think I'm misstating it when this is an exciting time for U.S. tax policy. We're all aware of the impact of the recent, or the outcome of the recent elections, but there are specific provisions in the tax code that line up for, I don't know, perfect storm might be the wrong word, but for at least something to happen. And look, I get it. I know a lot of us that are outside of DC or outside of tax policy, and I've heard from you. Hopefully you're in the audience today who have taken the, wake me up when it's all over and something has changed in tax policy. And I know you've probably sat in on panels, and our poor panelists have been there when we're hearing when there's a split Congress and we're talking about tax policy and tax extenders for the umpteenth time, or a very important minutia about R&D tax credit, or now what do we have to do to plan around a change in the estate and gift tax exemption amount. And as the joke goes, I've correctly predicted 11 out of the last 5 tax returns or tax reforms. But be that as may, I do want to say, look, we've got a new government coming in, and there are expiring provisions coming out of the TCJA, which we'll get into the specifics today. And so therefore, even if nothing happens, if nothing passes, there will be important changes to individual and business tax provisions. So all of that could lead towards some action. So the agenda for today, we'll talk about some of those expiring provisions. We'll talk about some of the proposals that have come out on the campaign trail. Then we'll talk about other tax policy issues that are certainly going to be part of the discussion in the new year. So let's get into the intro. I first just want to say, if there's any press on the call, please reach out to me or BHBA, but the speakers are here in their personal capacity. So first, we have someone well known to our community, is Professor Ed McCaffery. He is the Robert C. Packard Trustee Chair in Law and Professor of Law, Economics, and Political Science at USC here. And we know Ed as one of the driving forces behind the USC Tax Institute. I know he's a chair and keynote speaker before, and Loren has actually spoken at the conference there. If you're familiar with tax policy, I'm sure you've heard of the statement buy, borrow, and die. I know I've heard it 1,000 times, but I did not know that Ed was the one who coined that phrase. And if you want to learn more, he's got a really cool webpage, peoplestaxpage.org, where he has cartoons and live action videos to explain tax policy issues. Okay, and then next up, as much as I love seeing everyone in person, since we're remote, we have the ability to bring in folks outside of our region. So we have Loren Pons from Washington, D.C. She's a member at Miller Chevalier law firm and the co-chair of their tax policy group. Prior to joining Miller, Loren was chief tax counsel for the majority at the U.S. Congress House Ways and Means from 27 to 2018, and she will definitely add some good experience to contribute to this conversation. Loren is fluent in French and German, and before going to the Hill, was on the global tax team from a Big Four accounting firm. And Loren, I'm going to restrict your conversation to exclude transfer pricing. Don't make me enforce that, but we can talk about some international policies as we get into it.
Yes. Then, I also wanted to say I was not the chief tax counsel at Ways and Means. I was a tax counsel.
Okay. All right. Well, then that leads us to Andrew Grossman, who is chief tax counsel, currently on the Democratic side for House Ways and Means. So he is right in the thick of things and will definitely be involved in things as they evolve. Prior to joining Ways and Means, Andrew was a legislative counsel at Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation. And full disclosure, Andrew was so kind to listen to all my ridiculous questions when I was visiting counsel at JCT. And as I recall, in the Venn diagram of tax attorneys and acoustic guitar players, Andrew is right at the top, and I am not at the top. So, Andrew, hoping your important job, you still have time to bring the guitar around. So, all right, enough of that. Let's get into it. And I just wanted to say, I think now is a really good time to have this discussion as the year ends and we're waiting for the changeover in government, to kind of get our ducks in a row and see what issues are on the table and where we can foresee some of these topics going. So before we get into the weeds, I want to start with our panelists and go around the horn. And just if from a high level, if you're not living and breathing tax policy on a day-to-day basis, how do you describe the environment? How are you feeling about tax policy going into 2025? Now, what are the main things on your radar? So let me start with Andrew, and I don't know, Andrew, if you have a disclaimer you want to start with, that's good too.
Sure. I may as well start with kind of the standard disclaimer that you get when you have congressional staff speaking on panels, which is to say that I'm not here representing Ranking Member Neal or members of the Ways and Means Committee, but rather speaking only on behalf of myself as somebody who, of course, is fairly familiar with the thinking of members of Congress and the like, but not a spokesperson for them in any official capacity. Listen, 2025 is going to be a big year in tax policy. Before the federal, the recent election, I had my doubts as to just to what extent 2025 could be a sea change year in tax policy. But as folks who follow these things well know, when you have a trifecta, when you have both the House, the Senate, as well as the White House, that's a pretty good sign that you're going to see some movement in tax policy on one way or the other. And as these tides ebb and flow. I will say I was invited to this panel before the election, which may explain why you have a Democrat on this panel rather than a Republican here from the House. But that's okay because I'm pretty long in the tooth for Capitol Hill by Capitol Hill standards, and I kind of have an idea of which way things go. As you mentioned, clearly the thing that's on everyone's mind is expiration of a significant portion of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions. In 2018, at the end of 2017, when the Republicans enacted TCJA, many of the individual provisions were enacted on a temporary basis, temporary being roughly through 2025. Why did they do that? We can talk about that a little more when we start talking about budget reconciliation rules. But the fact of the matter is that that's kind of what they needed to do in order to meet their political constraints. And so, back when I was working on that bill, when I was at JCT, I figured I certainly wouldn't be on Capitol Hill when that check came due in 2025, and yet here I am, some 8 years later, just same old thing. So that is kind of the central focus around which members of Congress are going to be, centering their thoughts on tax policy. But a lot of things, of course, swirl around that. Obviously, there continue to be discussions around business tax reform, especially in the international tax space. President Trump obviously made quite a few campaign promises related to tax, and some of those are actually quite expensive, and we can talk a little bit more about that and where those might fit into any tax bill. And then, of course, in the realm of fiscal constraints, there's a wide variety of views among members of Congress as to the appropriateness of deficit spending at this stage in the business cycle. And it's going to be interesting to see the kind of push and pull on deficits, especially given rising interest rates, and what the market can handle, so to speak, especially when you have an extremely tight margin, both in the Senate, but even tighter, oddly, in the House of Representatives, where you're going to have, at full strength, a 220 to 215 margin in the House. So it's going to be a really interesting tax law for political year in tax law for political wonks like me, and for folks who are whose business depends on what happens in the world of tax policy. There are certainly going to be a lot of things that I would be following in 2025.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And for the record, I don't care who's in the majority, you're always welcome on BHBA and enlighten us. So next, I guess, Loren, do you want to have any open remarks from the Gucci wearing folks?
Sure. I think Andrew kind of laid it out nicely in terms of the substance. The driving factor will be the expiration of the individual provisions in 199 Cap A. And that would have been the case regardless of who was in charge. No one wants to be responsible for increasing taxes on individuals, people also known as voters. So, that's what's pushing this whole process. I think apart from the substance of provisions that will expire, and we will talk about reconciliation and why in 2017 we had to have kind of the phasing out of not just the individual rates in 199 Cap A, but also things that are popular for business taxpayers like R&D deductibility, limited interest expense deduction, going from EBITDA to EBIT, and bonus depreciation. They all kind of phase out as the budget window starts to close, and there are reasons for that in a reconciliation posture. And so apart from those, I think there are some non-tax factors that will have a huge impact on this bill, some of which were mentioned by Andrew. One is deficit. So how do we start with the reconciliation bill? What is going to be the deficit number to which the reconciliation bill is written? What is the appetite for that amount of debt over the 10-year budget window? The second is the margins, which will, of course, feature into how this number comes to be. The Republicans in the House are not only do they have a very small majority, they have a very wide-ranging, diverse group of folks who have very different opinions about what should be in the bill, what deficit should look like, what deficit spending should look like, how we're going to get to the finish line. And so, the whip and the speaker's office are going to have to do a lot of work to kind of keep this very, very disparate group of people in some ways together so that they can vote on a majority basis to get this thing across the finish line. The other thing that's going to happen, regardless of what is done from a tax policy perspective, is, time will march forward. So we have a calendar in that we have a deadline for the expiration of these provisions, but also midterms are looming in 2026. And so you saw this in 2017. There was a real push to get TCJA over the finish line, which happened at the end of 17. And then in 2018, everything changed in the House. And so you lose that trifecta one party that is able to push things through on a reconciliation basis. So there's just not that much time. There's this budget and then next year's budget, and that's it. So this tight timeline plus the kind of tight margins and disparate viewpoints plus deficit all are swirling around just the substance of what actually ends up in the bill. And then, all of these things could coalesce and result in just a straight up extension with no real thought about how do we make tax policy better? How do we make what was in TCJA more effective? How do we add on things that weren't in TCJA? The world has changed from an international perspective. We've made a lot of progress with Pillar 2, not as much progress with Pillar 1 in the OECD space. We've seen a proliferation of what Treasury calls novel extraterritorial taxes. So how do we deal with those? Is it going to be a dates and rates exercise, or is it going to be something a little bit more substantive to deal with how the world has changed?
Excellent. Thank you, Loren. Okay, Professor, would you like to give your overall thoughts?
Sure. I'd love to always follow Andrew and Loren. I want them to come to all my classes. And then when it gets to me, I can just tell jokes, which is some of my former students, if they're out there, might know is what I do. I don't know if it's what I do best, but it's what I most like to do. But really agreeing with, I think Andrew and Loren have teed up our presentation very well. And Robert's done a lot of work behind the scenes to get us this coordinated. So I'm just kind of honored and appreciate being on the panel. I think in terms of looking at this topic, I think we start with the TCJA. We start with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. As Andrew alluded to, there is a long pattern. Professors with beards can talk about the long scope of time. So you go back to Reagan, and basically when a Republican president has the trifecta, he cuts taxes. When a Democrat has the trifecta, he raises spending. That's an unsustainable dynamic for deficits. And the question we all have, we're waiting for Godot. We're waiting for anybody other than a commentator on a panel to say that deficits matter. But deficits are in the air. One thing I want to talk about maybe here, maybe later, is the way that Congress enjoys this situation. Congress wants to make money. Congress makes money. Congress fundraises off tax reform. So it likes the idea that there's some constraints, that maybe there are more ideas than we can afford. Let's start with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That was the only, we don't remember this maybe, that was the only major act of legislation that Trump got ever in his whole 4 years, but in the trifecta. And as Loren reminded us all, it came at the end of 2017. So I would expect the end of 2025. Congress is going to string this out. Trump has already signaled an interesting signal that he's going to leave things up to Congress. Trump could say what he wants to do, put his foot down. He's got 53 votes in the Senate. That's fine. He's not going to do that. He didn't do that last time. He let Congress and the committees fight it out. He let people fundraise. There's stories about carried interest and so forth. Everything revolves around money. By everything, I mean everything in life, but everything in tax policy. Both Andrew and Loren have talked about the reconciliation process. We will get back to that. But to put some flesh on those bones, we're getting scoring estimates that making permanent, just extending the TCJA and making it permanent would cost between 4 and 5 trillion. We're now talking in T's, 4 and 5 trillion. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act was scored at 1.5 trillion. Maybe it became 2 trillion. It was nowhere near 4 or 5 trillion. 4 or 5 trillion is a very large number for anybody except Elon Musk who may be listening. So let's start with that number and think, can we get there? And we're going to be talking about, can we get there, and do we have that much money throughout the whole year of 2025? Because it's going to be midnight on December 31st maybe a little bit earlier if they want their Christmas holiday vacation, but it's going to be in December that the ink is going to be put to paper and start to dry. Can we afford 4 to 5 trillion? Can we play the accounting games? Loren referred to the various reasons we had to phase things in and out. But another reason we phase things in and out is for political reasons. Presidents plant time bombs for the next generation, and they're able to enact dramatic changes and reduce their revenue cost by saying it's only a 2-year patch, it's a 4-year patch, it's a 7-year patch. So do we play those kinds of games? Do we stay on the treadmill of sunsets and extensions and expiring provisions? Can we get the number down? Do we get the number down because of tariffs? Do we say tariffs are bringing in money? Do we say that tariffs are bringing in money even if they're not bringing in money? Do we have a pliant scoring mechanism, whether it's the CBO or somebody else that the Trump administration has producing the numbers? And will they say they're going to bring in enough money from tariffs? Remember, we're going to talk about a lot of sort of little things, kind of Christmas tree ornaments like exempting tip income. But Trump also floated the idea of abolishing the income tax. Well, that's a big, expensive thing. We're not going to get close to that unless we get some money from some other source. So I predict a whole year of this. I predict let's book up a return in December of 2025. We'll have the same panel. We'll be looking at pretty final drafts of legislation, and the talk will be what kind of midnight deals will be made. But there will be an extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. There will be games played. There will be lobbying money spent. And we're going to end the year with, a lower tax burden than we start the year with, but tariffs aside.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you all for those remarks. Okay. So let's move in to the specifics here. But what I wanted to start with is a little bit of the process, and no one better than Andrew here to discuss budget reconciliation. And the reason is because as Loren mentioned, when I went into policy, I thought, what are we doing and how are we making tax policy better? But, once you get an understanding of process, and it was explained to me that a lot of the things you might not have drawn up on a whiteboard are the result of political compromise and the restraints that they have to work with. And so understanding the restraints, I think, goes a long way, that everyone's mentioned, into what will actually come out of this. So let's get to the explanation and kind of some flavor on this process, Andrew. So if you could walk us through it.
Sure. As I talked about, sort of the ebbs and flows of tax legislating, oftentimes those ebbs and flows are related to one-party control, but in the United States Senate, by and large, one-party control in and of itself is not enough. That's because the Senate under regular operating conditions has a 60-vote threshold to invoke cloture on any bill, and that means, for all intents and purposes, that you need a supermajority of senators to pass most legislation. The reason why the budget reconciliation process is used, especially in tax legislation, in those situations, is because it is the one sort of silver bullet that members of Congress have to override, to work around, I shouldn't say override, to work around the filibuster. And so any bill that's enacted under those auspices requires only 51 votes in the United States Senate in order to pass. But of course, that process comes with a lot of drawbacks. This is not how you would design a legislative system if you were starting from scratch, suffice it to say. The entire budget reconciliation process is sort of, it's a creature of the 1974 Budget Act. It's generally the rules that were set out were designed to sort of ease passage of budgets without extraneous riders on them, and in some cases to smooth the path towards solving our deficit crises. It certainly hasn't worked out that way. In fact, it has only served to really increase our deficits. But essentially, the way the budget reconciliation process works is it requires both chambers, first in the House and the Senate, to agree upon an overall deficit target, and that could be you have to lower deficits. We have to agree that we're going to have a bill that lowers deficits, or we can say we can all agree that the deficit will not be increased by X amount over 10 years pursuant to this bill that we're all going to agree upon. And additionally, in addition to those top line numbers, the committees have to agree on which committees of jurisdiction are able to contribute to this effort, and then actually parcel out the different budget targets for each committee. It's a very intricate and difficult planning task. In the context of the TCJA, there were actually two committees that had a budget instruction. One was the vast majority of the deficit cutting, the deficit spending was to the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance committees, but also the Energy and Natural Resource committees got a little bit of the action too, and that was to open up some lands in Anwar. In other recent examples, the American Rescue Plan and Build Back Better, jurisdiction was given to multiple committees, and in order to plan out the exact amount of spending that each committee can do, you have to do a lot of work in advance to get a sense of just how much these various policies cost, and invariably the planning goes awry. And when you get a score back from CBO and you say, oh my gosh, this is actually a lot more expensive than we had anticipated, and then committees are often left scrambling, trying to either cut things back, shorten time periods, and the like. It's a messy process, and it often is made messier by members of Congress's desire to move quickly. The reason why they want to move quickly, as I think Loren alluded to and Professor McCaffery alluded to, is that the political clout that a new administration has doesn't last all that long. And as things kind of linger out there and go on and on and on, members get very anxious because they're worried all of a sudden people start talking about the next election, and they start running for campaigns. And so there's this real push and pull between a process that really is actually quite intricate and requires careful planning, and members of Congress who want things done extremely quickly, they're not great bedfellows, let's put it that way. This has been my experience over the past 10 years of doing these things. The other thing I will say about budget reconciliation is that it has some rules, especially when you get into the Senate. You may hear them referred to as the Byrd rules, named after former West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd. And those rules have a serious impact on the substance of any kind of legislation that goes through this process. Most importantly, of those rules that are most important, are that the bill cannot have any out year, by which I mean beyond 10 years, effect on the deficit, at least a negative effect on the deficit, which is why we saw that the TCJA, for instance, expired at the end of 2025, or at least the individual provisions did. In TCJA, they had enough razors in the out years to make the corporate provisions permanent, but the individual provisions, when you added those on, they were too much, and the out years would have had a deficit effect. That's why we saw the Bush tax cuts originally sunset in 2010, and then again we extended it through 2012. It's why we are sort of constantly facing many of these tax cliffs, notwithstanding the fact that we have these big tax bills. It's because of the restrictions on out year deficit spending. Additionally, there's a rule about provisions needing to have primarily having a budget impact. That's important, and it came to a head when the Democrats had the trifecta in the context of immigration reform. Does immigration reform have an impact on the budget? Almost certainly. If you are legalizing more people and you're potentially increasing the population, there's no doubt that there would be a budgetary impact. But what the parliamentarian in the Senate ruled was that wasn't the primary purpose of immigration reform, and therefore it was not something that was suitable for a budget reconciliation process, notwithstanding the fact that there was an actual budgetary impact to any potential considered legislation. Lastly, the other thing I will mention is that you cannot touch Social Security in a budget reconciliation bill. So that's sort of the one sacrosanct thing. But it's not just limited to tax. Any other things on the spending side are pretty much fair game, other than Social Security. And so you may see discussions that extend far beyond the silo that me and Loren and Ed work in.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think we're all a more informed citizenry after all this, and we'll have at least some context to why all this is moving the way it does. So why don't we go ahead and move forward into some of the specifics regarding TCJA. I know we talked about it in general. As Ed mentioned, I think the estimate for extending TCJA would be 4 to 5 billion. If you throw, or trillion, sorry, if you throw in the SALT cap repeal limitation, that's another billion. So I mean, it just keeps moving. So Loren, we'll start with you on TCJA expiring provisions. I mean, if you want to speak to it in general, or if there are any of the ones that you think really are important, from your perspective, or if you think some of these would be, piecemeal or taken as a whole, where are you viewing the expiration of these provisions?
Yeah, I think it's important. So we've referenced kind of the individual provisions. So everyone's individual rate. So the brackets all moved down a little bit. The top rate went from 39.6 to 37. And so I think that everyone understands those rules, but then there, 199 Cap A is the pass-through deduction meant to kind of equalize rates between pass-through and corporate structures. There are a variety of changes to the international provisions, but those are razors. So the rate on GILTI will go up. The deduction for FDII goes down to match that rate. So GILTI and FDII will both have an effective rate of about 16.4%. The beat rate goes up, so you'll have a higher rate on those deductible payments that are disallowed under the beat provisions. And then some various credits are scheduled to go away, or in the treatment of like CFC look through. It's not a credit, but like WOTC, new markets, things of that nature. So there are a bunch of things that are subject to change. I think what's really important is the cost. So you mentioned, I think generally accepted numbers are around 4.5. We'll say 4.5 trillion for a 10-year extension of just the way things are today. And I'm also leaving out the business provisions that I mentioned earlier with regard to R&D interest and bonus depreciation. So there's a lot in there. I don't want to belabor the point of tight margins and deficit and reconciliation constraints, but those are the things that are going to dictate how we end up with what we end up with. And that's just the way it is. So, people think, well, it's easy to do this, but not that. It's not always the case. These things are, Andrew was at JCT when I was at Ways and Means. And so we would get JCT scores and you would think it would be one thing and it would be another. And it is what it is, because what JCT says is how much it costs for tax provision purposes when you're legislating. So how these things interact, expected behaviors of taxpayers, all kinds of other factors go into the scoring. And then, we alluded to this, Andrew alluded to this as well, but that deficit number that you're writing to in a reconciliation bill, that is your hard stop. And so everything has to add up. And if we know that, we thought we would be writing to a $1 trillion deficit. So 1.5 was a little bit of a gift. Like we had, extra $500 billion. But it's not up to the tax writers to determine what that number is. That's a separate exercise, and so you get the number, you write to the number. I feel very strongly, I don't want to say I'm certain, but I'm pretty sure the deficit number is not going to be 4.6 trillion. That would be hard. So that means some decisions are going to have to be made. And what will those look like? We don't know. Anybody who tells you today they know what's going to be in the bill more than a year from now or about a year from now is lying to you. They can't.
Right. Well, and it brings up some, practical, I know we have some tax planners on the call I've heard some interesting conversations of, okay, well, this provision set to expire. What if we, advise our clients to try to last it out until 2026? Is that something worth doing, if nothing changes? So, no one actually knows the answer, but there's some interesting thought processes going through. So let's go back to Ed and get, you mentioned that you're fairly certain something is going to happen with the TCJA extensions. But on the next few slides, we have some of the provisions set to expire. But Ed, you want to give your thought on the expirings?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And again, it's wonderful to be following everybody else. I mean, one thing I would do from my academic perspective is add a little cynicism, which is we've had this budget reconciliation process since, as Andrew said, 1974. It was a post-Watergate reform era. Remember Watergate? Remember the post-Watergate reform eras? Well, none of those reforms are left. We don't have campaign financing. We don't have an independent judiciary. We don't have an independent IRS. Everything we did to rein in Nixon has been busted through. But Congress has had 50 years to figure out how to game the system. So Congress, they're not being evil. They just need money. Congress, both House and Senate people need fabulous amounts of money for these reelection campaigns. Even if they have a safe seat, they're expected to raise money to give to their colleagues. So they like this. Think of this as the opening of a bidding window. Everybody's happy. All the lobbyists are happy. K Street is happy. And the window has to close. If the window doesn't close, people don't know when to write the check. So the window will close in December of 2025. So no doubt this will happen. It's important to Trump. It's important to Trump's legacy. It's a continuation of Trump 1. He said he's going to cut taxes. A lot of people have given him a lot of money to cut taxes. There will be a TCJA extension. On a specific thing, there will not be a fall in the gift and estate tax exemption. There never has been. Only in 1933 did the estate tax exemption ever go down. So we talk about it's coming back. We get campaign contributions to extend it. We end up extending it. So on that one, I would be safe. But I would feel safe advising clients not to do a panicky thing because you think this already extremely high exemption level may fall. I think that's not good advice for clients. Let me just briefly say one more thing, kind of getting into the big picture, because we're tax people, we've slipped into the weeds and the small picture. Here's the big picture of Republican tax policy going back to Reagan. It's to take the income tax and to make it into a wage tax for the masses. For 95, one of the things the TCJA did was it eliminated the need to itemize. 95% of Americans do not itemize. Half of Americans don't pay income taxes. 90% of the Americans who pay income taxes are filling out a very short form. They're paying taxes on their wages. They don't have anything else. If we look at Project 2025, which is an important document for tax, Project 2025 has a tax chapter, and the recommendation is a continuation of the Grover-Norquist plan to basically have a flat wage tax. So Project 2025 has two rate brackets, a 15% rate bracket extending out to the end of the Social Security. I think it's 170,000 of income now. So 15% income tax up to 170, and then a 30% income tax. Well, if you add the payroll tax and the income tax, you have a flat 30% tax on wages. It's only on wages. Nobody has any deductions to take. So I would be skeptical of things like SALT. SALT is odd anyway because it's largely a blue state issue. It's of interest to California, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois. They all voted the wrong way. Yes, we're getting swing districts that in those states, New Jersey too, that are beginning to go Republican, maybe in part because of the SALT issue. But we forget this, that we repealed SALT, they repealed SALT, Trump repealed SALT, or limits it down to $10,000. At the same time, you're moving away from the AMT. When we had a full SALT deduction, we had a vigorous AMT, which was capturing most of the preference of the SALT deduction. So I don't think we're going to go back to a more complex income tax with more itemization. I think we're going to make it simple. If we go to full Rothification, which Project 2025 is talking about, you have a tax system that taxes your wages. You can then put your wages in a Roth account and never pay tax again. That's the way Social Security works. That's the way the payroll tax works. A tax that, the employer can pay. Voters, Loren alluded to voters. You always have to think of voters. Voters don't have to fill out forms. You could say you've gotten rid of the income tax. So big picture, I would expect something to be done. What is to be done will extend the TCJA. It will be a tax cut. And it will be another step, and maybe a major step, in the death of the income tax. We're just going to keep getting closer to one day some president, Republican with the trifecta, can pull the plug on the whole thing. So that's the lens through which I see these specific things. Maybe we'll fight over exempting tip income. That's in the direction of moving away from the income tax. Maybe we do something with the child tax credit. That's an interesting question. I don't see SALT happening. I think that's a move that only a Democrat trifecta might consider.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And yeah, these were the potential Trump things he mentioned on the campaign trail. Of course, as the saying goes, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. But Andrew, I think you mentioned it on the budget reconciliation. The one thing you can't do is touch Social Security. So I do find it interesting when you're exempting type of income that you'd have to do some kind of gymnastics where maybe you exempt from the income tax, but not from Social Security or something like that, which sounds like.
I mean, actually, in the code, the default is actually that it's not exempted from the Social Security wage base, right? You have to sort of explicitly carve it out at 3121, I think. But you raise an important point, which is, two important points. One is that I don't know if you were to exempt, say, overtime income and then also carve it out of the Social Security wage base, whether or not that would run afoul of the restrictions under the Byrd rule. Which raises the larger point is that I don't think anybody knows, because a lot of it is kind of just all made up. The Senate parliamentarian is a very powerful position, but she operates in a world based on precedent that no one has seen or read, kind of frankly makes not much sense to me personally. I've never really had to deal with this process as a House person, but it does sort of emphasize the point that we don't you don't always know when you're drafting when you're drafting these things what will fly with the Senate parliamentarian and what won't.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's change topics a little bit, and Loren, we come back to you on some, let's say, non-TCJA stuff. We get a lot of questions around the IRA energy credits, if there's any concern there. Ed mentioned estate tax, so we won't get into that, but energy credits or anything on the international scale. You mentioned some of the phase outs that'll raise GILTI or BEAT or FDII, but anything else non-TCJA related?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people are asking, are some Republicans' claims to repeal and replace some of the energy tax credits that were passed through IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, kind of just talk, or are they serious about them? I think the conventional wisdom is that there've just been too many investments in red states thus far in reliance on some of those credits for them to be able to reasonably repeal. I think the one that's most likely to be on the chopping block or get some extra scrutiny are probably the individual EV credits. But everything else, I just think it's talk. It's really hard to have every time there's a change in the trifecta, there's a lot of talk about repeal and replace, and then they get in there and they're like, oh, we can't do that. So I wouldn't give it much credence. There are also some questions floating around about the Congressional Review Act and what regulations might be on the chopping block. From that perspective, there's a really good article in Tax Notes today talking about the CRA and what final regulations actually fall in that window and could be subject to being pulled. Not too many significant ones in my tax world, but there are some in there. But I think that the bigger conversation is, what's going to impact revenue. We're going to get into a conversation about tariffs, but it's important to think about, regulations. Pulling regulations without legislative change really doesn't have an impact on any score. You have to keep rulemaking separate from lawmaking when you're thinking about a reconciliation package. So just things to think about as we down the road.
Great. And you mentioned revenue raisers, and Ed, you touched on tariffs, but for us people in the tax weeds, can you explain tariffs and how this plays in and your viewpoint on it?
Yeah, so basically from an economic point of view, tariffs suck. From a political point of view, they're 90% popular. So Trump wins and all of us academic wonks lose. But I think this is an important slide, an important thing to bring into our conversation, because we're sitting here at the end of 2024. Trump has just been elected. He wants to go big. That's what Trump always wants to do. And he wants to be a disruptor. So you see the appointments, Gates and Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard. And so he wants to go in there and be big. And he's got Elon Musk in charge of Doge. And he has ideas on this bullet point. Right. So this is the way they're connected to everything we've been talking about. And we've centered it around money. We've centered it around the reconciliation process. The bottom line on the reconciliation process is Congress is going to be given a number, and that number is by how much they can cut taxes. So I think it's a tale of two stories. One story, Trump is dreaming big. He's appointing these radical disruptors. They're going to take on the deep state. You fight authority, and authority always wins. Does the deep state win? Does all of this stuff not happen? But if this stuff does happen, so tariffs, not necessarily a good idea, a regressive tax, but it could raise a lot of revenue. Trump puts in tariffs in 2016. After 2016, all the Democrats bitch about them, and none of the Democrats repeal the tariffs. Biden and Harris don't repeal those tariffs. Once you put a tariff in place, nobody really knows who pays it. It could raise a lot of money. We could say it raises a lot of money. We've talked about deficits throughout. Deficits are in the air. Where do deficits come from? Well, in part, this pattern of Republicans cutting taxes and Democrats raising spending, and that's an exploding equilibrium. That's an ever-increasing deficit. All roads seem to meet at the entitlements of Social Security and Medicare. That's about half of what government spends money on. And that's where we put Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So does that mean, and we've got a second-term Trump who doesn't care about his reelection, we don't think. So does that mean we're actually, Musk is talking about cutting government waste by $2 trillion. That's like a third of the budget. So he's talking about cutting $2 trillion out. Trump is talking about getting 2 or 4 trillion from tariffs. Do we go big and get numbers like that? Those policies are not necessarily going to make Americans happy. Anything you do to touch the entitlements is not going to make Americans happy. What is going to make Americans happy? Tax cuts. So I think that there's one story where this is going to end up being much ado about nothing, and the deep state will win, and we'll keep looking like we've always looked, notwithstanding periodic political gyrations that might suggest bigger changes. Or does it work? Does it work with the trifecta? Does it work with the American public? Can we take big tariffs and spending cuts and use them to slash the most hated tax, which is the income tax? So that's where I think all those things are related. It's not really whether or not tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea or who's going to pay them. It's whether or not politically they're going to happen. What can we say from a scoring point of view about what tariffs will bring in? And can we take that projected money, that phantom monopoly money, and use it to justify bigger tax cuts? I think that's clearly what Trump wants to do. And if you're thinking of ever cutting entitlements, well, having Elon Musk play the bad guy and having massive tax cuts be the sugar sweetener, it's a strategy. So again, we'll meet again next December, but I think it could be one of those two stories. We could end up going big or staying small.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Loren.
I was just going to point out, you raised the issue, Professor, of, do we get the revenue boost from tariffs? But I think they have to legislate tariffs. You can't take that money from executive order tariff imposition and use it in a reconciliation bill and say, hey, we've got an offset for these things that cost a ton of money.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking, Loren, of how many rules that we're talking about now are going to be broken, are going to be, whether it's because of client administrators, client senator. I mean, the senators, there are a lot of senators who said they were fine with the recess thing. And the recess thing means they go on vacation while Trump appointees become effectively permanent. I mean, again, if Trump if Trump has a bully pulpit now, he's got power now, what does he want to use his power on? But if he's tariff, and anybody who doesn't let him use his tariffs to cut taxes, that's what he wanted the Tax Cut and Jobs Act to be named, by the way. He wanted it to be the Tax Cut and Jobs Act.
I know.
Yeah.
I was there.
So are they going to stand? If Trump starts saying this and he's got 90% of the American people behind him, are the rules going to hold?
Right. I should say that I'm prefacing all my statements based on the rule of law and how we operate today. But you raise valid points. Things can change.
I mean, and to in fairness to what Ed's saying, I mean, if you look at sort of recent congressional precedent on a bipartisan basis, so for instance, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the like, the senators basically all just sort of got together and agreed that they were going to call this thing paid for. right? And there was no, you can't find an official CBO score that says that was paid for, but they said, but if you squint here and we say that we're going to redirect some of this money and redirect some of this money, and then well, it's basically paid for, and then because like that was seen for some key senators as a political impediment to otherwise voting yes, that gave them cover to do so. So I think what Professor McCaffery is saying is sort of like, well, can Trump, by saying, I'm going to do these tariffs and they're going to raise $5 trillion, just because but the power of Trump saying that, give folks, that kind of political cover that they need. It's a good question.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're running short on time. I think we talked about a lot of these. Loren, I did want to give you a minute to see what you wanted to say about global tax status and the OECD work and where you envision that going or not going.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say. So Pillar 2, there's been a lot of progress. Pillar 1 is pretty stalled. What I'm paying attention to next year is Chairman Smith of Ways and Means put out a Section 899, a proposed introduced bill, kind of putting forth retaliatory measures on countries that impose kind of DSTs, digital services taxes, and some new ideas, strange, novel extraterritorial taxes, things of that nature. Do we use a combination of tariffs and bills like Section 899 to impose political pressure on countries that have these taxes that Pillar 1 was meant to combat? What do we do about the progress that Treasury may have made thus far in terms of negotiating a better outcome for our non-refundable R&D credit in the Pillar 2 context? It's always hard when administrations change and you have a new DAS and negotiating positions are different. So we'll see where that goes. Is there any appetite for them to legislate some differences, some changes to GILTI so that we look more Pillar 2 compliant? And if not, where does that leave U.S. multinationals in the mix, in the crosshairs of Pillar 2? But those are more questions than answers.
No. Understood. Okay, well, we're running out of time here. This has been a really great discussion. I did want to give one last go around the horn. Any concluding remarks? Andrew, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's going to be a really interesting year for those who are interested in tax policy and like the intersection of policy and politics. I'm not in the position that I would have liked to be in, suffice it to say, headed into 2025. But with in a world with really tight margins in the House, who knows when the majority ends up needing to cut a deal to need minority votes. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens.
Great, thank you. And so Ed and Loren, I didn't want to put Andrew on the spot, but now I'm going to ask you all for your crystal ball on predictions of what do you think is going to happen.
I can't. I just told everybody that anyone who tells them what's going to be in the bill is lying to them. So I can't tell you anything right now. I do think that we will end up with a bill. Next year at this time, or close to this time, we'll be dissecting new provisions and trying to figure out what they mean, assuming that they do something different and we're not just looking at some kind of updated version of what we did in 2017.
Yeah. Okay, Ed.
Okay, and first answering a couple, I just happened to glance down at the Q&A. So to answer a question for Loren, what Loren meant by pass-throughs are the partnerships, S corporations, LLCs, where the entity itself doesn't pay tax, but the tax gets passed through to individuals on their Schedule Ks. And somebody asked about, are we panelists okay with being on LinkedIn? I would be fine with anybody connecting with me on LinkedIn if I were connected on LinkedIn, but I'm not. So you can send me an email, and it's pretty easy to find my email address. It's emcaffery@law .usc.edu. I think you find it at USC. So now for the crystal ball, like I've said, there will be a bill. There will be a bill. The bill will happen in December, either December 31st or an earlier date in December, right before the holiday break, either they come back. There will be drama. There will be, articles, panicking moments where crazy ideas are floated and lobbyists have to descend on Washington. Business as usual will go on, in that people are going to pay for tax benefits that they get and industries are going to pay. And then I think everyone just has to stay tuned. I think it's too early to give specific client advice. I'm with Loren on that. No one knows it. If everybody knew what was going to happen, nobody would have to pay for it. So in my focus on, tax is the number one issue that legislatures fundraise off. It's the number one issue that people pay for in lobbying, and that's good for Congress. They need that money. How many lawyers on this call turn away clients? So if you can create your own market by floating tax ideas that need to be paid for, you're going to do that, and that's what we'll see. There'll be a feeding frenzy, and at the end of the day, we'll get, my guess, crystal ball, radical tax cuts, no spending cuts, and our grandchildren will be figuring out how to fix a deficit, because we'll just keep kicking that can down the road. But keep coming to BHBA events, and in tax in particular. I think stay tuned as the year unfolds.
All right. Well, we're out of time, so I'd like to thank our panelists. This was great, and I do like the idea of a year from now, this might be a good discussion. So with that, Philip, I don't know if there's anything else. We'll turn it back over to BHBA.
All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much, you all, for joining us today.
You may be eligible for CLE credit in your state. Visit bhba.org/podcasts for more information.